And now it's recording. Okay, well, excellent. Adam, thank you for being here with us this evening. This is Adam Gordon, and he is with the Attorney General's office.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm very excited to be here. Can everybody hear me? Just a thumbs up. Excellent. So Shasti, Reyes, and I are very excited to be here, obviously talking about fentanyl. It's an issue that we work on 27 or 24/7. So I'm a federal prosecutor. Shasti is the head of our director of outreach and communications. We have some terrific partners. I'm excited that Alex is here from the County Board of Education. We have obviously an issue that we need to talk about our kids with, which is fentanyl. It is driving a significant number of deaths for children 18 and under. And there's some things which are missed that we're going to try to dispel today. And then there are other things that are unfortunately deadly serious that we're going to speak about in some detail. So our talk is about 10 ways to protect your children from fentanyl. And at the end, we're going to be able to answer some questions, hopefully, if we have time. But I just want to start at 10,000 feet, talking about what is fentanyl. Shasti, can we do that first slide? So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, meaning that it's not grown from anything. There's no leaf, there's no plant. And then it is unfortunately about 50 times stronger than heroin, 100 times stronger than morphine, which is of course a drug that you would use to treat pain. Fentanyl was developed in about 1959. The purpose of fentanyl was late-stage cancer treatments. So fentanyl in and of itself at the time was used in a variety of circumstances. If somebody was coming in with, say, a very traumatic wound, about to enter surgery. And about 10 years ago, we really saw fentanyl taking off in pill form, mostly in oxycodone and Percocet. So it was included in a variety of different prescriptions, but a domestic demand for fentanyl developed. That domestic demand was really accelerated, but at the same time, the supply of especially what we call blues or counterfeit M30 hydrocodone, oxycodone pills was significantly diminished when the DEA and other litigation stopped doctors and pharmacies from overprescribing these types of pain medications. Unfortunately, by that time, the domestic demand for fentanyl or for these pain medications continued to be there. So the cartels and drug trafficking organizations filled in the gap of this supply for fentanyl. And what we see now is a significant number of fentanyl deaths, about 817 last year in San Diego County, and we lost about 20 school kids. Shasti, can we do the next slide? In terms of our seizures, we see many seizures at the Otay Mesa Port of Entry, the San Ysidro Port of Entry. We actually have 6 different port of entries in the Southern District of California, which is where Shasti and I work. In terms of the seizure numbers, unfortunately, we're up about 3 tons of fentanyl that's been seized, both in pill and powdered form in the last fiscal year. So we'll talk a little bit about how deadly fentanyl is, but the moral of the story is that there is a ton of fentanyl that's flooding the streets, specifically of the San Diego County community. We put a press release out about 2 months ago that talked about how 60% of all the fentanyl seized comes through our district, meaning comes through our community. That doesn't mean that it all stays here. A lot of the drugs are then further transported to Los Angeles or Denver or Chicago or Houston or wherever you want. But most of those drugs, or at least the majority of those drugs, are initially coming through San Diego ports of entry. Shasta, let's do the next slide. All right, so this is what we were talking about in the beginning, how fentanyl was originally just a drug that was developed by drug makers. It wasn't a good or a bad thing. Now, what we see is particularly dangerous and damaging to our children is, of course, illegal fentanyl. And you'll see it especially at the bottom right. I may refer to blues. What those are counterfeit M30s. So a counterfeit form of oxycodone that are particularly prevalent, being seized both in a border, and then we also seize by individuals who are north side distribution cells, we would consider drug dealers, who sell blues specifically to children. So we've seen a lot of illegal fentanyl flooding into the streets of San Diego. Shasta, let's do the next slide. We also see rainbow fentanyl pills. The reason behind this is kind of complicated, but we were talking about those blues, those counterfeit pills that individuals will try to consume thinking that they're pain medication. Is part of the cartels and drug trafficking organizations kind of lure to perhaps younger children or people who are more susceptible to perhaps counterfeit pills, they're starting to mark their pills in different ways. There are no pink or purple or green actual M30s. These are all counterfeit pills that are being seized at the port of entry. And why do I keep talking about pills so much? Because in the cases that I review, and in the majority of my cases, what we call resulting in death cases, where someone provides a fatal dose of fentanyl to a victim, over on the federal side where I prosecute, those individuals are liable up to a 20-year federal minimum mandatory. And in the cases we have involving children, what they're consuming are these counterfeit pills. I've yet to see cases of children consuming powdered fentanyl or injecting powdered fentanyl. It's mostly individuals 18 years and under who think that they're consuming another type of drug, Xanax, Adderall, but unfortunately end up consuming a counterfeit M30. And about 41% of the pills that we seize contain a deadly dose of fentanyl. So I'm going to turn it over to Shasti now to talk about the next little bit.
Thank you, Adam. So like Adam said, what we mostly see in young kids is that they are taking these counterfeit pills. And as you all know, and in the world that we live, you know, pills are very common, which I think makes it a lot easier for young people to experiment with a pill. You know, we have a headache. What do? We go to our medicine cabinet, grab an Advil, Tylenol, and take that for our headache. So I think for young kids, it's really easy if they get offered a pill. They don't think twice of whether it has fentanyl or not. They just see it more as something normal. But like Adam said, we're seeing these pills that are being created in you know, random labs. So these drug dealers get these chemicals, they put together these pills that might look very similar to what your doctor might prescribe, and so they're massively creating these in labs. And what these drug dealers are doing is that they're mixing certain powders, they're throwing in some fentanyl, and they're mixing it together. But in these labs, there's no quality control. They don't care. Their purpose is to mass produce these pills and sell them. And as you can see in the image below, it might be that one of these pills might have no fentanyl, another pill can have maybe a little bit of fentanyl, and another pill, sorry, can have enough fentanyl to kill a few individuals. So that's one of the things that, you know, when you're talking to your kids or talking to your youth, just really focusing, if somebody offers you a pill, if it's not prescribed to you by your doctor, you should not be taking it. And sometimes an analogy that I use with kids or young kids is, when you eat a chocolate chip cookie, you know, your first chocolate chip cookie might have a couple chocolate chips. The other one might have double the amount. So you never know what you're getting with these counterfeit pills. So now to just give you an idea and help you understand this, we're going to play a little bit of a game. And Cynthia, I believe, is the chat function open? I think it is. So
Yes,
you can either type it in the chat, or you can just kind of say it out loud to yourself. But I'm going to show you two images, and I'm going to ask you to try to identify the real one. So we're going to start with this Beyonce image. So, you know, if you can tell me which one's the real Beyonce, 1 or 2. And you don't have to put it in the chat, just kind of, you know, to answer the question at your own. So to go with that one, I'm going to show you that the first one is the real Beyonce. The second one is a wax figure. So now we're going to go move on to the Nikes. Which ones are the real Nikes, 1 or 2? So the first ones are the fake ones, the second ones are the real ones. Now we're going to talk about Percocet. Which one of these two Percocets is the real one? Which one is laced with fentanyl? So the first one is the real one, the second one has fentanyl. The Xanax, which one's the real one? The first one or the second one? So the first one is actually the real thing. this Vicodin, which one's the real one and which one's the fake one? Yeah, so I saw somebody in the chat saying, I can't tell. Yes, it's a little challenging just by telling these images. So the second one is the real one. The first one is laced with fentanyl. And these M30, which Adam mentioned, this is mostly what we see when we have seizures. So which one is the real one, the first one or the second one? So this one's a bit of a trick question. They're actually both fake. And the reason why we play this little game and share these images with you guys, it's because you can't tell, just by looking at a pill, you can't tell whether it has fentanyl, whether it's prescribed to you or not. You can't tell whether it's laced with fentanyl or not. So, when we send it to the lab, these individuals have to test the pills to determine whether it has fentanyl, because you can't smell it, you can't see it, and you can't taste fentanyl. So when you're talking to your youth, really focus on that and really try to drive that home, that it's really hard to tell whether a pill is fake or real, so they can think twice before taking something that's not prescribed to them. Another thing that we continue to see among young folks is social media, really monitoring the kids' social media. And the reason why I mention this is because nowadays, it's really easy and accessible to obtain these drugs. What we're seeing, especially among younger kids, is that they might be obtaining it from a complete stranger through social media. And it's easy to get via social media. It's easy for them to have it delivered to your home. So really keeping track of what your kids are doing on social media, keeping track of those passwords and usernames, kind of taking note, who are they talking with? So we really encourage that, just because social media has become a new market for young kids to get these counterfeit pills. Another thing is that when we talk amongst each other, we usually use our words and whatnot. And what we're seeing nowadays is that when kids are obtaining these social media, whether it be through their cell phone or through a social media platform, they're not using, our typical words. So if you're looking through your child's phone or social media platforms, you're not going to see, hey, can I get a Percocet? What you're going to see most likely are these emoji figures. And there is a full list of emojis. And as you can see, a certain combination of emojis means a different thing. And if you're wondering, well, I can't memorize these, where can I get them? We actually, and I will share this with Cynthia, we have a fentanyl toolkit where we have a full sheet of emojis where you can download the sheet and kind of have it there for your own personal reference. And then know the signs of fentanyl overdoses. And I think this one's it's a very important thing. Although we think it's never going to happen to us, it's never going to happen to our kids. We have so much fentanyl coming in every day that it could happen to you. You just never know. And it's better to be prepared. And I think fentanyl overdose looks very different for every person. But some things to keep in mind is, some of those signs of fentanyl overdose look like, somebody's sleeping, somebody's resting or nodding. Another sign of it is, vomiting, snoring or gurgling sounds, the blue-gray eyes. So if you do see any of these, make sure you call for help right away. It doesn't matter if you're not sure if it is a fentanyl overdose or not, but just definitely if you start seeing some of these symptoms, make sure that you call and ask for help. And then and I will share a quick story with you guys of how these symptoms can be very similar to something else. Just a couple months ago, I was getting my nails done, and outside of the nail parlor, there was a group of young teenagers, and I could see from the window that they're all crowding around a young boy. but nobody's doing anything about it. And all of a sudden I see this young boy collapse. He's unconscious, he's vomiting, he's not reacting. And I'm seeing this from the window and I don't see anyone doing anything. Thankfully, it was just he had a lot to drink, so he was drinking alcohol, and it was not a fentanyl overdose, but the signs were very similar. So if you do encounter any of this, make sure you call and try to get help right away. And like I said, if you are seeing somebody like me, that I saw this young man and I wasn't sure if it was a fentanyl overdose or what it was, I made sure to call the paramedics right away. But while I was waiting for the paramedics to respond, I kept an eye on this young man. I put him, face down where he wasn't gonna, so he wouldn't choke on his vomit. I was, we were checking his mouth, making sure he was breathing. We were just shaking him and making sure he was okay. And I was doing all of this while speaking to the paramedics. And while I was there, I did ask the kids, "Hey, did your friend take any pills or any drugs?" And the kids were like, "Oh, we're not that kind of kids. We don't do that." And I was like, "I'm not here to judge. I'm not here. I just want to make sure that your friend is safe and we get him the correct, the best help." So, these are just things to consider if you ever encounter a situation like this, or if your kids are out with friends and encounter this, just sharing this information can definitely make the difference. So I'm gonna pass it over to Adam to do the next few slides.
Thanks, Chastity. I just wanted to start with a couple stats because it's hard to get a sense of like what the scope of the problem, but thankfully we have some good research on this. So the latest nationwide stat is about 1 in 20, or about 5% of eighth graders self-report using a drug other than marijuana. So the scale of the problem is like potentially one kid per class. And what we know from the reports of 12th graders in the nationwide survey is that overall drug use among high school kids, thankfully, is going down. So what we have is a drug in fentanyl that has increased the risk to a smaller section of each of these potential classes. But at the same time, we're now asking more of our kids because we're not only saying, hey, these drugs are dangerous, but also asking them to recognize a sign of an overdose. That wasn't something in my lived experience when I was growing up. I may try to take care of somebody who was drunk or maybe if they were high, but I wasn't worried about the potential fatality associated with them using a counterfeit drug. That's where this Good Samaritan law comes in. And I think it's something that important that we communicate to our children. Why is it important? So if you're actually reporting to law enforcement, to a paramedic, the medical distress that somebody's in, even if you're personally using or you have drugs in your possession, you can't get in trouble under this Good Samaritan law. What are we trying to incentivize? We're trying to incentivize kids and people who are around drug users to call 911, to err on the side of caution so that they're not worried about getting in trouble. They're worried about trying to save somebody's life. And that's a hard conversation to have with a high school kid about, hey, listen, you may be in a situation where there's drugs in a room, but you got to default to calling 911. It's asking a lot of them, but unfortunately, that's where we are because of the scourge of fentanyl. Shasta, let's do the next slide. So it's very important in terms of our harm reduction, education, and outreach to talk about naloxone. You may have already heard of this as Narcan. What is it? It's a way that actually reverses the chemical effects of an opioid, so it saves lives. It's hugely important to have readily available and widely available. Why? Because it's very easy to deploy, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. But ultimately, what does naloxone and what does Narcan do? It saves lives, and that's why we want to have it so readily available. So whether or not you have heard about it before, now there are tons of different giveaways, and maybe Alex will talk a little bit about how it's available and where it's available in schools and pharmacies and giveaways with a variety of stakeholder organizations. But everybody can say that it is widely effective. And Shasta, let's go to the next slide so we can talk a little bit about how it's deployed. It basically comes in a standard box with 2 deployments. Think of it as just a standard nose spray. So you actually just remove it from the box. you stick it in somebody's nose, and you actually deploy it that way. It is super straightforward. And I was giving a presentation at a high school last week. Shasti and I were there, and it was a great question. Like, hey, listen, if somebody's not actually having an opioid overdose, they're having some sort of other thing, they're drunk, or maybe they're high on weed, or they've eaten an edible. Is it harm to the individual if you use naloxone? No. So the moral of the story is, if you have somebody who you think are overdosing and you deploy naloxone and it turns out that they're not actually having an opioid event, it doesn't hurt them. It's not going to harm them. So that's why we encourage it to be as widely available as possible. Shasti, let's do the next one. So, I don't want to kind of preach to the choir, because obviously people on the on this Zoom are interested in how to approach your children. The one thing I would say is, unfortunately, we just have a lot of cases. And so where I come in is I review a lot of people's phones of deceased teenagers, and I speak to a lot of teenagers. So I kind of have a sense of the use patterns. So it's not IVs. You should be looking for potentially foils, because these counterfeit pills, some people ingest just by taking the pill. Some people actually like smash up and then snort it. And some people will burn it and inhale it. So if you're a parent, you should be looking for things like what? You should be looking for those tutors, basically like broken pins that can use to snort or smoke. Also, like tinfoil with burn lines. So basically like black lines, if you ever see that with a child, or for whatever reason, you just see random pills. And again, we think that it's not good enough to have these conversations in high school. We need to be even having these conversations earlier, because of that stat that I was talking about, where 1 in 20 eighth grader reports experimenting with something other than marijuana. So there's a lot of different ways to have these conversations, and I can't pretend to speak to each person's family, but having these conversations early and often is critically important. Shasta, you want to do the next one?
Yes, another way to really help with this, and like Adam said, I remember growing up and being a teenager, and this is definitely something different than when I was growing up. But another one is to establish a text call rescue plan. Just talking to your child and coming up with a plan. Let's say they're in a party or out with friends, or and they're in a difficult situation and they don't know how to get out of the situation. Them just feeling comfortable sending you a text message with the letter X or whichever code word you guys decide on, but you as a parent knowing, okay, my child is in danger. I'm not going to ask questions right yet at that moment, but I'm gonna, that code means give my child a call and tell them, something around the lines like, I need you to come home right away, or I'm on my way to get you. And that's a way of, helping our children get out of a difficult situation they might be. And we're seeing this being used a lot more by parents to just kind of approach those difficult situations that they might encounter. We hope that's not the case, but if it does, that's a way to kind of help keep our youth safe and help them through a tough situation. Another thing is just monitoring medication at home, or whenever we know kids nowadays are playing sports, they can get injured, they get their wisdom teeth taken out, whatever it may be. Sometimes they're giving these medications that could result into something else, or so just really monitoring and keeping safe any kind of medication, whether it's yours, your elderly parents, or any medication that's at home, keeping it safe. What we're also seeing is that a lot of these youth, they're not actually going out and asking for a fentanyl pill. They might be asking for a Xanax or some kind of other pill to help maybe with anxiety or stress, or prepping for a test. But what they don't realize is that some of these pills are laced with fentanyl, and they're not actually seeking it. They're just happen to get a pill. Or some of our youth just want to experiment, they want to know what it is. So just kind of keeping that in mind, and just monitoring that. And if your child or a loved one is in a situation where they have become addicted, it is okay to get treatment, explore that treatment option. I know there's a lot of stigma behind it, but definitely it is out there, and there's support and assistance to get through a difficult situation if ever encountered. Another thing that, and Adam was mentioning a little bit about this, of, signs of whether or not your child is using some kind of substance. And if you guys are not familiar with this is a great page. So this is actually it's a physical trailer designed to look like a youth's or a child's bedroom. And basically, because of COVID, they made this virtual. So you, when you click on the link there, you can tour this or kind of walk around through your screen through this bedroom, and you have to try to identify there's signs in the bedroom that tell you whether your child is using or not, or where they could potentially hide, some of these drugs that they could be using, and I've personally have done this, and I probably missed more than half of them. So if you do, it's a great way to kind of see, some red flags. For example, one of them was if your child has a bottle of water next to their bedstand that hasn't moved in a really long time and is just sitting there, it could potentially be a hiding spot to hide drugs, or an empty toothpaste box in the bathroom. So it has all these little kind of things to, like Adam said, the empty pens that might be red flags. So I highly encourage you to look at this website to get an idea. And then lastly, this is just a short version, or not a short version, but is some of the information that we thought would be most relevant to you. If you wanted to get a lot of more of the stats and background on fentanyl, we do have a fentanyl toolkit for community and parents. We also have a presentation that shares a little bit more about Snapchat and how juveniles are getting some drugs through Snapchat. If you're not familiar with the platform and don't know how to use the platform, it gives you an overview of that. So there's a lot of different resources in both of these links if you're interested in learning more about fentanyl in general. And with that, Adam, do you have anything else to add?
I don't. I'll stick around for questions at the end, but I want to turn it over to Alex. She's with the San Diego County Board of Education. And thanks again to everybody for the time.
Thank you very much. That was really informative. I definitely learned some stuff there, so thank you. My name is Alex Swift. I work for the San Diego County Office of Education, and I work for two programs. One is called Friday Night Live, which is a youth development program that gives young people the skills they need to make healthy choices and also be leaders and advocates for themselves and their communities. And I also work for our county's tobacco use prevention education program. So that's why I'm here today, because we're going to talk about tobacco, but specifically vaping. And we're mostly going to talk about vaping because any vaping product that contains nicotine is a tobacco product. So there are different vaping devices. There's a lot of different brands, a lot of different types. Some can have nicotine, some can have marijuana, but any vaping device that contains nicotine is considered a tobacco product. And so you have to be 21 or older to purchase any tobacco product. I'm going to start off with a little bit of history on where electronic smoking devices came from and how they evolved, starting with the first generation of vaping devices or electronic smoking devices. And those were these e-cigarettes or cig-alike devices. They first came out here in the United States in 2007. And at that time, they looked like traditional cigarettes, and some even came packaged like traditional cigarettes. But inside one of these devices, there's a battery, there's an atomizer, that's the part that does the heating, and then there's somewhere for the e-liquid to go. So anytime there is a device that has a battery, an atomizer, and one of those liquids, it's considered an electronic smoking device or a vaping device. So these devices a lot of times were disposable and weren't usually flavored. But as they started to get more popular, they started to evolve and change. The second generation of e-cigarettes or electronic smoking devices, or these vape pens, Inside this device, there's still a battery, there's still an atomizer, there's still somewhere for that e-liquid to go, but the devices started to change to get away from that look of traditional cigarettes. And then more flavors were coming out with these devices to the point where there was over 15,000 different flavors of e-liquids available. And that's important because when we look at flavored products, flavored tobacco products, there's a ton of research that shows that flavored tobacco products are more appealing to young people. That's why flavored cigarettes have been banned since 2009. Cigarettes can't be flavored anymore with the exception of menthol because the research shows that flavored tobacco products are more appealing to young people. The third generation of these electronic smoking devices were the box mods or the tank devices. These devices still have a battery, they still have an atomizer, they still have somewhere for that e-liquid to go, but the devices definitely don't look like a traditional cigarette. They're usually more modifiable, rechargeable, refillable. And again, lots of flavors available with these ones. The fourth generation are the pod mod devices, or simply pod devices. This is the generation of Juul. And this is really where we kind of saw vaping take off in a way that it had never been before. It was a kind of a new phenomenon. And that's thanks to Juul. Juul first came out in 2015, and they really quickly got really popular, especially with young people, for a couple of key reasons. One is their design. So inside this device, there's still a battery, there's still an atomizer, there's still somewhere for that e-liquid to go. But Juul hired designers who had previously worked at other tech companies like Apple to design their devices because they wanted something that was going to be trendy and sleek and techy. And so they were really successful in getting people to kind of become obsessed with the design and how they looked. Additionally, they used the power of social media to promote their products. And then, of course, flavors. They had some very popular flavors, including mango, some other fruity flavors, some other sweet flavors, but mango was definitely one of the most popular. And these flavored products. And additionally, Juul also used nicotine salts as the nicotine in their liquid. So prior to the popularity of Juul in e-liquids, in vaping devices, that liquid had freebase nicotine, which that nicotine is more basic on the pH scale, and freebase nicotine had a more harsh throat hit. So it was more painful to use, basically, more similar to traditional cigarettes. But Juul didn't come up with nicotine salts, but they definitely made them popular, made them the industry standard. And what nicotine salts are, or nic salts, is it's nicotine that's been mixed with an acid. So it's more acidic. And because it's more acidic, although this kind of seems counterintuitive because we usually think of acidic things as more harsh, but nicotine salts being more acidic makes them smoother. So these devices were sleek and slender and trendy. They had flavors that were really appealing, and it was a smoother inhalation, smoother to use. And one of the things that happened with Juul is at the time that they were getting really popular, there were a lot of people using them, and a lot of people didn't know that they contained nicotine. There's some studies that show that as many as 2/3 of people under 21 who were using Juul products did not know that they contained nicotine at all, which is a significant number of people using a product with something that is highly addictive and not knowing at all that they were getting that in their body. So that's pretty significant. And not only do they always contain nicotine, Juul products that is, but they can contain high levels of nicotine. One Juul pod can contain the same amount of nicotine as up to 2 full packs of cigarettes. So it's 40 cigarettes worth of nicotine in one Juul pod. And Juul products aren't as popular anymore as they were prior to 2019. And that's because so many young people were using them. So many young people were becoming dependent on nicotine as a result that lawmakers got together and they banned flavors in these pod devices. So Juul could no longer sell flavors. The only flavors they can sell in their pods are tobacco, which are going to taste more like traditional cigarettes, or menthol. And so a lot of people quickly stopped using them and made the switch to one of the devices that could still have flavors. One of the exceptions to that flavor ban was disposable devices. And the reason disposable devices were an exception is because that first generation, which were the ones that they were thinking of, the ones that look like traditional cigarettes, they weren't always flavored to begin with, definitely not the fruity and sweet flavors. But one of the devices that came out around this time in 2019 and got really popular really quickly, kind of taking that place of Juul, was Puff Bar. And one of the problems with Puff Bar is that, like Juul, they always contain nicotine, but they also contain a lot of nicotine. So a regular Puff Bar, because Puff Bar makes different sizes, but a regular Puff Bar, one of these that's rectangular, has the same amount of nicotine as 50 cigarettes. So it's 2.5 packs of cigarettes worth of nicotine in one Puff Bar, and Puff Bar always contains nicotine. There are other devices that are popular now as well, things like Flume. Flume also always contains nicotine. And one of the things, most of the time I spend my days talking about this stuff with students, middle schools and high schools, and giving a presentation similar to this. And one of the things that I think is really important to stress here is that our brains continue to develop until we're in our mid-20s. And especially during the teenage years, there's a lot of really important development that's happening. And because this development is happening and the way nicotine interacts with our brain when we use it, nicotine can cause changes in the way that our brain works. So that's something that is definitely important to talk with our young people about in terms of what the effects of vaping can be. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in a minute about what's actually being inhaled when a vaping device is being used, but especially when we're looking at these ones like Puff Bar, like Flume, like Hype Bars, Cloud Bars, different brands, that because they don't look like a cigarette and they don't smell like a cigarette and they don't taste like a cigarette, it's really easy to think that it's not going to be harmful like a cigarette. But with many of these devices, they contain really high amounts of nicotine. They contain more nicotine than our young people would be exposed to with traditional cigarettes. And so that can be really serious, because with these devices, because they use nic salts, so it's smoother to inhale, and because it's fruity flavors, and because young people might not know that it's nicotine, this nicotine dependence that we're seeing, the nicotine addiction, can happen really quickly and really severely. It gets out of hand really easily. And the reason that it can get out of hand so easily is because of what's actually happening in the brain. I'm going to play a video. It's just a few minutes long. It's available on YouTube, and I'll put the link in the chat. So if you want to go back and watch it again, or if you want to watch it with your students, with your young people, but it explains what is actually happening in the brain when someone uses alcohol or tobacco, so any product with nicotine, or even marijuana and some other drugs as well, what's actually happening in the brain. This video, I think, does a really good job of explaining that. So we're going to watch that really quick. Let me put the link in the chat. So if you have to jump off, or if you want to save that and watch it again, or like I said, watch it with your young people, there it is. And here we go. if it lets. My internet doesn't like to work in the evenings, apparently.
When you bite into an apple, your brain says, yum. Your brain recognizes that this apple is good for you. It has nutrition, vitamins, and gives your body the energy it needs to survive. Whenever the brain recognizes something that's good, it releases a chemical called dopamine. Dopamine causes you to experience pleasure. It's what makes you feel good, like when biting into an apple. The brain releases this dopamine in order to teach the body that this is healthy and good for your survival, and that it should remember to do it again. Now, there are other things we do that can release the pleasurable dopamine, like playing video games, exercising, or reading a good book. However, the amount of dopamine released during these activities is less than what's released when we eat food. The brain does this so it can recognize which is more important. So if you go 2 days without reading a book, or 2 days without eating food, your body is going to crave the food over the book. As such, your brain creates what's called a hierarchy of survival, which ranks how important each of these things is to your survival. Now, there are some things that will not cause the release of dopamine, like eating soap or punching yourself in the face. The brain knows that these things are not good and therefore does not release the pleasurable dopamine because your brain does not want you to do it again. Now, let's look at alcohol, marijuana, tobacco, and other drugs. These are all classified carcinogens, proven to cause cancer and other fatal diseases. Now, your brain should recognize that these things are harmful to your body. However, these substances have special chemical characteristics that fool the brain into releasing dopamine, oftentimes in much greater amounts than the body has ever experienced before. Because of this, the body is fooled into thinking that these things are good and important, sometimes even more important than food, water, or sleep, and consequently hijacks the #1 spot in your survival hierarchy. So now, if you go 2 days without eating or 2 days without drinking alcohol, your body will actually crave the alcohol over the food. This is an extreme case of addiction, where the person addicted believes that they will die if they don't get it. The severity of the addiction depends on where the alcohol or drug lies within your hierarchy of survival, and can increase even with casual use. Research shows that people under the age of 21 are at the highest risk of having their survival hierarchy hijacked. Why? Because their brains are still growing and developing and are hypersensitive to false shocks of dopamine caused by these harmful substances. By 21, the brain is more fully developed and mature, and the survival hierarchy becomes more permanent and less susceptible to getting hijacked. The flip side is that once you are 21, it becomes very difficult to remove these harmful substances from your survival hierarchy. Studies show that 9 out of 10 people who currently struggle with addiction started drinking, smoking, or using before the age of 21.
So that's what's happening in the brain whenever someone uses one of these products. And the younger someone tries it, the faster and more severely they can become dependent or become addicted because of this, the way that our brains develop. So I think usually when I am presenting to young people, when I'm having conversations with young people, I spend the most time talking about brain development and nicotine, because I think it's one of the most important things when we're talking about this and how this process works, and how really it's not something that we can control, because we can't control the amount of dopamine that's being released in our brain. So no matter whether or not someone thinks that they are or aren't going to get addicted, that's not usually how it works, because nicotine causes these changes to our brain so quickly. Another thing that I want to talk about is some of the reasons why young people say that they think people start vaping, and then also places that they get it. So a couple of the things that I hear most frequently are that young people would start vaping because of peer pressure. Their friends are doing it because they think it's going to help with mental health issues. Like they think it's going to help them deal with anxiety, deal with stress, deal with something going on at home. or they want to experiment because they're curious, or people around them are doing it, like their family members. And for some of the other substances as well, like drinking, like using marijuana, that is usually an indicator of young people using, is if their parents or the people in their lives are using it and it becomes normal to them, it seems less harmful if the people that they look up to are doing it around them, where they can see where they're talking about it and stuff like that. And then the places that they get it, I think, is interesting because we do hear that young people get vaping devices. You know, obviously they're not 21, they can't legally purchase it in a store, but they do purchase them from stores if they know that they can go into a store and not get carded. That does happen. So it does happen that stores sell them to minors by not doing what they're supposed to be doing legally by checking IDs. But in addition to that, we know that young people can also get them pretty easily on social media, ordering them online, getting them from friends or relatives or older people that they know who are over 21 and can purchase them legally, and or taking them from their parents or taking them from someone else living in the home without their knowledge. So that is some of the ways that we know young people are able to access these devices and access those nicotine products. And then when it comes to vaping, there's a lot of different chemicals that are being inhaled, and you may have seen or heard some of the things like formaldehyde and metals and lead. This is a list of chemicals that have been found in the what's being inhaled when an electronic smoking device is being used. And what it is that's being inhaled is actually an aerosol. So anytime a vaping device is being used, whether or not there's nicotine, whether or not it's marijuana, whether or not it's flavored, it's an aerosol that's being inhaled. And what I mean by that is that an aerosol is tiny particles suspended in gas that leave behind a residue. And for some of the other aerosols that you might be a little bit more familiar with, the fact that an aerosol leaves behind a residue is exactly why we like it. So some other aerosols that you might have around the house are things like cooking spray. We spray it in a pan, and the residue that gets left behind makes it so that our food doesn't stick to the pan, and that's really useful. Or something like spray sunscreen. We spray it on our skin, a residue is left behind, and that keeps us from getting burned by the sun. So for a lot of things around the house, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, maybe in the garage, the residue that gets left behind when there's an aerosol is exactly the reason we like it and find it useful. But when someone is vaping, and again, this is regardless of the ingredients, regardless of the flavors, when someone is vaping and they're inhaling that aerosol, the residue is getting left behind in the lungs. Cigarette smoke is also an example of an aerosol. So whenever someone smokes a cigarette, they're inhaling an aerosol into their lungs, tiny particles suspended in gas that leave behind a residue. And it's that residue being left behind in the lungs that has nicotine, that has other chemicals, additives, sugars, acids, flavors, if it's something like menthol. It's that residue getting left behind in the lungs that makes people sick from smoking cigarettes. So we know that long-term smoking can cause things like lung cancer and heart disease, throat cancer. There are a lot of health issues that are associated with smoking cigarettes. And the reason that those health issues happen is because when someone smokes, they're inhaling an aerosol into their lungs. So when someone is vaping, that same thing is happening. There's an aerosol that's getting left behind in the lungs, and that aerosol can be a bunch of different chemicals. There's definitely nicotine in there, but other chemicals as well. And so again, this happens with marijuana also. Marijuana smoke is an aerosol, whether, no matter what it's being smoked from. And then when someone's vaping marijuana as well, it's an aerosol that's being inhaled. And one of the things that's interesting to note here is that the reason that we know all of the harm that can come from smoking cigarettes long term is because there are people who have smoked cigarettes for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and we can see what happens to their bodies when they've been smoking for that long. But when it comes to vaping devices, we actually don't know what those long-term health effects are because vaping devices haven't been around for that long. They've only been around for about the last 15 years, but really popular the last 5 to 8 years or so. And so we don't know what happens to people's bodies when they've been vaping for 20, 30, 40 years because the devices just haven't been around for that long yet. People haven't been vaping for that long. We do know that it doesn't take decades of vaping to have some negative health impacts because that has already occurred. There's already people that have gotten sick due to vaping, that have been hospitalized, that have had their lungs collapse, that have had to get lung transplants. That's not to say that every time someone vapes, their lungs are going to collapse, or every time someone vapes, they're going to have to get a lung transplant, just like not every time someone smokes do they get lung cancer. But those are some risks that can happen from vaping, and it doesn't take decades of use. These things can happen after just a couple of years, because even though these devices don't look like cigarettes and they don't taste like cigarettes and they don't smell like cigarettes, either way, the ones that are considered tobacco products that have nicotine, you're still getting nicotine into the brain, and that can change the way that the brain works, especially when it's still developing during the teenage years. And either way, the person using it is inhaling an aerosol. And an aerosol can cause harm to the lungs because our lungs aren't meant to inhale aerosols. They're basically only meant to inhale air. So anytime an aerosol is being inhaled, whether it's from a cigarette, from marijuana, from a vaping device, from any other source, it can do damage to the lungs. The last thing I want to talk about is marijuana edibles, because I talk a lot about aerosols and how they're dangerous to the lungs. But marijuana edibles don't involve smoking or vaping, so they're not going to be harmful to the lungs. But that doesn't mean that they're better, safer, anything like that. And here's the thing with marijuana edibles. They can come in several different forms. So it can be baked goods, it can be candy, it can be beverages. And with edibles, when something goes through our digestive system, it takes longer for our body to process it. And so oftentimes when someone uses marijuana edibles, they can use too much really easily because it has to be processed through their digestive system. So it can take up to several hours for someone to feel something. And if someone takes a small amount of an edible, waits for a little while, it doesn't work, they take a little bit more, still doesn't work, takes a little bit more, still doesn't work. It can hit all at once in a way that inhaling it doesn't do, because when we inhale marijuana or tobacco or vape it, it takes about 5 to 7 seconds for the nicotine or the THC, the tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the chemical in marijuana that gets you high. It takes 5 to 7 seconds to get from our lungs to our brain. So it doesn't take that long to feel the effects, but edibles are different. They can take longer, and it's going to be different times for different people depending on our digestive system. So that can be dangerous. The other thing with marijuana edibles is that anytime marijuana is being used, if it has the THC in it, the tetrahydrocannabinol, and it's getting to the brain, that can have the same effect that nicotine has. Nicotine causes a greater release of dopamine, so the dependence can happen faster than it does with marijuana. But marijuana does the same thing. So it hijacks that hierarchy of survival, and THC does that in our brain. But THC interacts with a couple other parts of our brain as well. And so there are different things that THC does. And so when we're looking at these things, it's I think the most important is that these chemicals, whether it's nicotine from a tobacco product or THC from marijuana, is that the teenage brain is hypersensitive to the changes, to the effects of these chemicals. And so no matter the reason that someone starts in the first place, whether it's to deal with stress or anxiety, or because they're curious, or because their friends are doing it, or because they're seeing it and they just want to know what it's like, it's going to affect the brain every time it's being used. And especially if someone's just trying to experiment, they're curious, they don't think it's going to be as harmful, it's that addiction can happen really quickly. And so I have some other resources that I want to pop in the chat. So I'm going to, if my mouse comes back, I'm going to stop sharing. And I think now that's all information I have. So I think we can open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions for myself or for Adam, you can pop them in the chat, or I'll also say if Cynthia has anything else to add in terms of how we want to do questions. Yeah, thank you all.
Yeah. I'm just gonna really quickly, I'm gonna stop recording.